Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. New polls suggest the Democratic National Convention gave President Obama a still growing bump. Yesterday's Gallup tracking poll put him at 49 to 45 against Mitt Romney. Romney's problems gaining altitude are not just metaphorical. After campaigning yesterday in Virginia, Romney and his campaign had to find a flight home when the campaign plane was grounded due to technical problems. Right now, my story of the week, what the president didn't say in Charlotte. This was, I think, my favorite moment in the president's speech on Thursday night.
My plan will continue to reduce the carbon pollution that is heating our planet because climate change is not a hoax. More droughts and floods and wildfires are not a joke. They are a threat to our children's future. And in this election, you can do something about it.
A fricking men, I say. Climate change was only invoked at the RNC as a laugh line and hardly mentioned at all for the DNC, save for 3 references, so it meant a lot to hear it from the president's own lips. But there was also something distressing in that line, something that haunted me and haunted the entire Democratic National Convention. It was this part.
And in this election, you can do something about it.
And in this election, you can do something about it. After the spectacle of dysfunction and obstruction over the last 2 years, it's hard to take that proposition at face value. Remember, in 2009, Barack Obama had a House majority by a 79-vote margin, a Senate majority of 60 votes, and to his credit, and the credit of him and the Democratic Party, and especially Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they worked tirelessly through a long, hard legislative slog to produce a bill that would cap carbon emissions. The Waxman-Markey bill passed Congress and the House by 7 votes. In the Senate, Lindsey Graham had once been a co-sponsor of a similar cap-and-trade bill. He'd even argued for the need to address carbon pollution.
Our country doesn't have a vision on carbon. We need one. And we need to lead the world rather than follow the world on carbon pollution.
Ultimately, Lindsey Graham did what nearly every Republican in his cohort has done, which is to conveniently forget his previous beliefs and instead commit himself to opposing any and all major legislative initiatives that bore the president's mark. And so cap and trade died. Now, keep in mind, all of this was before the Republicans took over the House in 2010. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The record of Republican opposition and obstruction is legion at this point. The record number of filibusters, the unprecedented foot-dragging on judicial and executive nominees, and, of course, the explicit threat to provoke a possible new financial crisis by holding the nation's full faith and credit hostage in pursuit of a savage austerity agenda. In fact, since the emergence of the Tea Party and its electoral success in the 2010 elections, the central political story of our time is of Republican obstruction. The ways in which, with remarkable discipline and fervor, the Republican Party has overturned the previous norms of congressional behavior in order to create a country that is nearly ungovernable. This is a reality that looms over this election. And yet the GOP opposition was almost entirely absent from the president's speech. Unless the Democratic Party manages to retake the House, a possible, though not probable outcome, the president's second term will face precisely the same obstacles it now does, a Republican Congress bent on his destruction and humiliation. The president, however, told Time magazine that if he wins in November, the stark choice voters will have made would, quote, pop the blister of polarization. If you're skeptical of that line, I don't blame you. But of course, whether the president believes that or not, he kind of has to say next time will be different. Otherwise, all of his articulation of his vision for the country in his speech on Thursday is more or less for naught. The cruel irony of the Mitch McConnell plan to sandbag Barack Obama is that it creates a devilishly cynical implied reason for voters to elect a Republican president, because it's the only way to restore the country to normal governance. The Republican Party is so wildly irresponsible, so sociopathically maximalist, that it cannot be trusted in opposition. You can only get compromise when Republicans have the power and the Democrats are the ones doing the compromising. Republicans won't let it work the other way around. It would be a true low point for American democracy if this argument were persuasive. But the president and Democrats need to acknowledge it head on in the remaining 2 months of this campaign. You can't simply ignore the tanned, weepy elephant in the room. If the president and Democrats are going to lay out their agenda for the next 4 years, they have to make an explicit case, either that it is vital the president be given a Democratic Congress, my strong preference, or some new set of policies, tactics, approaches, innovations to overcome or run an end around past Republican opposition. The decision to offer DREAM Act eligible youth a form of administrative reprieve was a great example of what this would look like. Whatever the case is, whatever the solutions are, we need to hear them, because the Republican Party and its agenda of political destruction cannot be ignored or willed away. Nor can the politics of self-immolation be perpetuated by rewarding them with electoral success. The president himself has suggested he will use executive powers, as he did with the DREAM Act, to circumvent an obstructionist Congress. But that is only the second best way to deal with Republican obstruction. What President Obama did not say in Charlotte was that the best way to stop Republicans from holding them hostage is to strip them of the power to do so in November. I'm joined now by Peter Beinart, senior writer for Newsweek and the Daily Beast and founder of the blog Open Zion, Michelle Goldberg, also at Newsweek and the Daily Beast, where she's a senior contributing writer, Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic congressional candidate in Hawaii, who spoke last week at the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, and Jacob Hacker, a professor of political science at Yale. It's great to have you all here this morning.
Thank you.
I want to start. I want to play a clip because we wrote this, we were working on this week, and then Meet the Press is airing an interview with Mitt Romney today. And this is a section of it that I want to show you because to me it just perfectly hits home this point. This is Mitt Romney speaking to David Gregory. Check it out.
Well, I want to maintain defense spending at the current level of the GDP. I don't want to keep bringing it down as the president's doing. This sequestration idea of the White House, which is cutting our defense, I think is an extraordinary miscalculation.
Republican leaders agreed to that deal to extend the debt ceiling.
That was a big mistake. I thought it was a mistake on the part of the White House to propose it. I think it was a mistake for Republicans to go along with it.
All right, so let's just keep in mind the context here. The Republicans held the debt ceiling hostage. A completely routine thing. In over the last 40 years, the debt ceiling's been raised something like 90 times, average of twice a year. There's routine posturing around it. This totally unprecedented departure from norms. The only way to get them to vote to maintain the full faith and credit of the United States was to agree to this deal in which both parties bound themselves to these cuts, which is called sequestration. This was the deal. This is what everyone agreed to after this climactic battle. This was the Democrats basically appeasing the Republicans who had exempted themselves from the normal procedures of governance on the deal of sequestration. And now, Mitt Romney is saying, oh, this deal is terrible. I'm the president. What a terrible person the president is for signing on to this deal. And my running mate who approved the deal, awful person. And John McCain is running around saying, terrible deal, terrible deal. They want to cut defense spending. And to me, it's like, wait a second. If you can't even, they won't even live up to the deal they themselves made months ago. How can we govern? Like, what is this second term going to look like?
Isn't this part of the problem that Obama was facing in this speech? I think a lot of people were disappointed in this speech because one of the things that we all loved, those of us who loved Obama in 2008, loved the fact that he seemed to level with people. He seemed to speak to people like adults. He seemed to forthrightly face our problems. I'm not sure that our political culture has gotten to the point where a presidential candidate kind of can forthrightly speak to the fact
the
that
truth about the nature of the Republican opposition. And the person that did do that, and was Bill Clinton. And I think the reason that Clinton speech was people liked it so much was he was just talking about the obvious elephant in the room, the obvious taboo. Here he is just talking about this preposterous asymmetry between the two parties in the way they're approaching cooperation in government.
One of the main reasons we ought to re-elect President Obama is that he is still committed to constructive cooperation. We all know that he also tried to work with congressional Republicans on health care, debt reduction, and new jobs. And that didn't work out so well. But it could have been because, as the Senate Republican leader said, in a remarkable moment of candor, 2 full years before the election, their number one priority was not to put America back to work. It was to put the president out of work. Well, wait a minute. Senator, I hate to break it to you, but we're going to keep President Obama on the job.
I think the feeling of exultation that people felt was, thank you for just stating the obvious thing about the nature of our politics, particularly domestic politics, I would say, in the last 2 years.
Yeah, for me, the failure of Obama's speech was he still didn't really explain to Americans why we're in this mess. I've never felt that President Obama has spent enough time trying to explain the financial crisis to people. Like, what actually happened and how did it affect your life? I think this is where Clinton was always really good, at connecting what was happening in people's lives to what was happening in the world. And then this is the second part. First, to explain the financial crisis, like why the bottom fell out of so many people's lives. And second, to explain why Obama wasn't able to do more about it. And I feel like he didn't do those things.
Well, and he didn't really get into the fact of public sector job loss, or nobody gets into that, which is amazing to me.
Which is important to say, that the stimulus was part of what kept things from going even further by...
I disagree, actually. I think he has. I mean, I think if you look at the speeches, he gave the speech at Georgetown very early on. That was a pretty long evocation of what he talked about the pillars built in sand, and he's
but not in that convention.
Not in that convention.
More on the stump.
But in the case of the problem with this Republican opposition issue, and I think the reason that Bill Clinton was able to talk about in the president is that they have laid this trap for him, because they have created this. What I was talking about at the top of the show, right? If he talks about Republican obstruction, it just reminds everyone what a dysfunctional mess Washington is, and that cynically aids the opposition. That's what's so maddening.
And also, he can't. I mean, Bill Clinton can say it's all their fault. I'm not sure that Obama can say it's all their fault.
But I don't think that talking about what a political mess it is necessarily against Obama's long-term interest. I mean, he was pretty articulate in the 2008 campaign about how our politics was broken. And if he was saying, look, we've got major economic challenges, but our politics isn't living up to it. He reprised some of those themes. He talked about how we need to have continuing political reform. I think that would resonate with a lot of people. So
I think it would, and that's what I've been hearing from people post-convention, people who don't live within this political world that we live and breathe, that they really appreciated President Clinton's speech because it just spoke the facts. It laid it out in a way that everyone can understand, people who are working every day and don't have time to pay attention to the day-to-day slog of the presidential campaigns.
Tulsi, you're about to, barring some big upset, I don't want to count your chickens before they hatch, but likely to be entering Congress next year, the least trusted institution in American life, approval ratings below Paris Hilton and the U.S. going communist. And I'm curious, when you think about what life is going to be like come January, what it looks like. Let's talk about that after we take this break.
Sure.
We're projecting into the future and talking about what the campaign argument looks like as we enter the stretch, and particularly what it says about what the future of governance will look like in Washington. And Tulsi, you're a candidate in Hawaii's 2nd District. You won the Democratic primary, a big come-from-behind upset. How do you think about what you're going to be going into in January should you be elected?
There's a couple things that I saw in my race in Hawaii, but I think that are very reflective also across the country, that I saw at the convention when I had the opportunity to meet some of the other Democratic candidates from other states, is people are really looking for that fresh leadership. People are looking for real people who will speak as we're speaking today, just having real conversations and actually listening. I think that's been the key thing there, and that's where I have hope, and I'm optimistic because of this very real energy that I think will be coming in with a crop of new legislators who are looking towards bringing back the statesmanship that I think a lot of our longtime elected officials say has been lost, especially in the last few years. For us in Hawaii, we have Senator Akaka, who's retiring, Senator Inouye, and they have constantly talked to us about how the statesmanship that they saw when they've been in office, about working with both sides and maintaining your principles and your values and actually getting things done is what is causing such an exodus. And I think that many of us who are looking to come back, if we have the privilege of serving, is looking to bring back that ability to work together for the people.
You're part of a class of Democrats running for Congress, and one of the things we've noted here, and it's something that we have done ourselves and are now trying to correct, is the presidential race takes up so much oxygen that the down ballot races aren't getting much attention. And I thought the Todd Akin moment was really revelatory, because it's like Todd Akin says that, and then it's like, wait, why are we not paying attention to Todd Akin before he said this? Because his views were sort of awful before that anyway. Do you feel that there is the money and grassroots support and the infrastructure focused on getting a Democratic House? Because that, to me, it seems within reach, though very difficult, an uphill climb, and also just crucially important when we're thinking about what that next term is going to look like.
That's a great point, and it is. It's absolutely critical when we're talking about, if President Obama is reelected, about having that cooperative relationship and actually being able to work together to get things done. I know that the Democratic leadership in the House is very excited, but optimistic but realistic as well about the challenge of being able to hit that 218 magic number, and are really focused on putting the resources into those races that are on those targeted lists. So I think that the opportunity is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we know as political scientists is that the down ballot races in a presidential election are determined by presidential coattails, whether there's significant turnout for the president. So it's important, the presidential race is important, but also I think the money matters a lot more on the down ballot than at the presidential level, because presidents, and presidential candidates get a lot of news, a lot of attention already. And there's both, Obama's a formidable fundraiser. Even if he's outspent, he's going to spend a lot. But on the down ballot races, that's where I think the real concern should be about this huge amount of outside spending. Yeah. I think that we've seen a real decline in competitive races over time, and this is one of the reasons.
I think turnout, you mentioned turnout, that is a critical factor in some of these races. Like in Hawaii, we have Mazie Hirono challenging Governor Linda Lingle. And turnout.
Is the Democratic nominee. Linda Lingle is the
Republican nominee to fill the seat that Senator Akaka is leaving. Turnout is going to be the key. There's going to be a substantial amount of money nationally that's going to be dumped into this race. But really, it is going to come down to turnout and getting out the vote.
I think one of the interesting things, is how much Obama is going to run against this money. It seems to me, how populist will he go? I mean, he could, if he wanted to say, look, Wall Street turned against me. They're the guys who got us into this. I made some effort to change things, and now they're basically trying to unseat me. I think it would actually be quite a powerful message. I wonder if he decides to go there.
And that's one thing that I saw that I had hoped he would talk about in his speech, was about the lack of true Wall Street reform, and what you mentioned earlier about how that has really been one of the major causes of our high unemployment rates and really the downed economy, and how there really hasn't been action taken or people being held accountable for that.
Let me say that I thought that people panned the president's speech, or some people panned the president's speech because it wasn't this sort of high-flying bit of oratory. I mean, I think one of the things we're going to talk about later in the show is the cutting edge of science of campaigns, and it seemed to me that what people wanted from the speech and what they were trying to do as a sort of strategic block in a wall that they're building for the campaign might have just been very different things, that there were certain marks they were trying to hit. And I thought one of the things that was striking to me about the Democratic Convention was it felt very deftly as if it was hitting certain strategic marks. It was hitting certain marks on choice. It was hitting certain marks on marriage equality and veterans and women and women's choice. And it sort of went through those. And sometimes it could feel like, well, there's no real uplift uniting theme here, but that may just be the most effective way of going about and marketing, because the amount of voters that when you're talking about designing a Democratic convention, the amount of voters that's really for in terms of persuadable universe is a very tiny subsect of the electorate at this point, right?
Yeah, and I think it was skillfully set up so that as the day went on, you would get the sort of base mobilization speeches, and then as you move to the primetime speeches, they focus much more on that small segment of voters that really are persuadable. And so I think it was a very well-run convention, and certainly contrasted sharply with the Republican convention in terms of the discipline on display and the organization of the themes. My own view on the president's speech is that it was a good speech. It wasn't a great speech. And the reason it fell short of great, in my view, is that it is really, I think, important for him to say what's going to happen after the election, how I'm going to address that concern about both the immediate jobs problem and the long-term economic challenges of the middle class. And he got close to that. Yeah. But ultimately, it felt to me like he was, falling back on sort of the familiar idea of invoking hope rather than setting out an agenda.
Well, we have this fiscal cliff that's coming up, which is going to is going to force things in a certain way. And I want to talk about what the dynamics of that might look like in terms of this persistent obstruction problem right after we take this break. So we've had this situation now. We've had tremendous, I think, really unprecedented Republican obstruction. I mean, I think it's really just important to kind of keep in mind that, the debt ceiling deal was this real break with the norms that had ruled Washington for a very long time. Obviously, the opposition party is going to oppose. That's what they're there. That's what they're there to do. It's not surprising, but we have this totally unprecedented form of obstruction. Now we have the debt ceiling deal. The debt ceiling microcosm. With much higher stakes in the fiscal cliff that's going to happen, which is all the Bush tax cuts expire, the sequestration goes into effect. It would be a huge, huge, horrible shock to the economy if all the taxes went up, the spending went down, we'd have this big effect. And there's an argument to be made that that's going to give the president leverage to deal with Republican obstruction. I'm curious what you guys make of that argument. I want to be persuaded by it.
Well, I think it will give the president leverage. How that will be used is another question. I mean, we learned during the last fight over expiration of the tax cuts that the Republicans were actually willing to do a lot to get the upper income tax cuts. They agreed to extensions of unemployment insurance. They agreed to continuation of the payroll tax cut. So strategically, the president has an opportunity that he wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, the problem right now is that everything he wants to do, like the Jobs Act, requires congressional action. With the Senate filibuster, nothing will happen. But this has to happen, right? And most of the observers, I think, now believe that the president would be in the best position if he just stuck to his guns and waited until December 31st, the expiration, and said, you know, Republicans can give up on their desire to have $800 billion in tax cuts for the rich.
Right.
And when they're ready to talk, I'm ready to deal. Now, it's still the case that, you know, that this could be politically damaging to Democrats as well as Republicans, and the fight that's going to take place is going to take place still on terrain that I think is favorable to Republicans in terms of some of their larger goals. But here I think he has a lot of leverage.
It should also be pointed out that if the president is reelected and he's making these negotiations, I mean, you know, he's at the peak of not having, I mean, first of all, he's in the second term. It's in the lame duck section after he's just been reelected. In terms of his own political capital, I don't think he has to worry in the same way about its erosion.
Yeah, and we don't, you know, it's hard to know what the psychological impact of the election will be the day after. You know, the Republicans were remarkably disciplined after Obama's victory. But I think that the mood, you know, the Republicans I know they really believed Obama's victory was a fluke because McCain had been a bad candidate. I think after losing an election that they should have won, given how bad the economy is, I think you're going to start to see the process of some people saying, we are in the wrong side of the country. Here. Now, maybe it'll take a third loss. Maybe we're still
9 losses in. We're sitting here at the table in 2016.
Sooner or later, we're going to have a Republican version of the Democratic Leadership Council and a struggle inside the Republican Party of the kind that the Democratic Party had in the late 1980s and early 90s.
But I think you're not going to have that until you have a candidate that actually represents the Republican Party losing, right? Because I was already hearing at the convention, and you're already seeing in the right-wing media that they've made the same mistake that they made in 2008, that they nominated a kind of squishy moderate. And when you nominate a squishy moderate,
but they put Paul Ryan
what happens.
I mean, that makes it harder to say.
They put Sarah Palin and McCain.
Yes, but they doubled down on the Medicare stuff.
They've already made these arguments to themselves.
Yeah, all those arguments are basically in the queue, and they're ready to fire them out.
I mean, I would not. I don't think you can underestimate the degree to which the Republicans are going to. Or overestimate the degree to which the Republicans are going to find confirmatory evidence that their agenda should continue to be pursued. So I think it's very unlikely that you're going to have a kind of reckoning within the party in the near term. For one thing, this is a lot more conservative party than we had after the 2008 election. And for another thing, you know, there's going to be this sense, well, Obama's the incumbent president. You know, things were bad, but they weren't bad enough. So I think the best opportunity for action is the action-forcing mechanism of the fiscal cliff.
And they've put in please.
Yeah, no, it just seems like, you know, there are the hardcore Republicans who have their minds made up, hardcore Democrats, minds made up, and really the results of this presidential election are going to be with that group of independents who I think are really looking for leadership, true leadership. And, you know, we've got the partisanship on both sides.
No, but it's not on both sides. I mean, come on. You know, I mean, we have you know, certainly you have partisan Democrats, but you don't have these kind of revanchist, you know, kind of bitter end Democrats who would rather destroy the country than see the Republicans have any political victory. And you certainly didn't see that with Bush. And the idea, you know, genuine independents, like persuadables, as opposed to people who say that they're independents but have kind of strong ideological leanings. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a pretty
very
small and disengaged part of the population. It's not as if they're the kind of reasonable ones and everybody else is.
I just don't think. I think the other thing to remember is that the electoral fight is only part of it. After the election, the same kind of organizational barriers to action are going to be there. There's going to be an enormous amount of money, lobbying money, to be protecting the status quo or trying to push back against financial regulation. prisons and healthcare reform. So, the challenge of just trying to implement the existing achievements of the administration will be formidable. But I think the other problem with this idea that the independents are going to be pressuring the Republicans is that, political scientists have been looking at this, and increasingly, we're very surprised, right? Because the parties are moving asymmetrically apart. The Republicans are going way to the right. The Democrats are moving modestly to the left. How can this be if the independent voters are roughly in the center? They haven't moved dramatically right or left, and we've been struggling through that. And what I would say is that the political scientists have reached a couple conclusions. One is that this is clearly activist-driven, right? So, and the activists on the right the Tea Party suggests, are really powerful.
Yeah,
so.
Hold that thought. I also want to note that you compare the first thing that the Democrats did when President George W. Bush was elected was work with him on No Child Left Behind, versus how Republicans responded. So there was this honeymoon period back in 2000. I want to pursue this question more because it's going to affect what that Congress looks like that you're going to possibly be going into in January, right after we take this break.
There's something I've noticed lately, you probably have too, and it's this. Maybe just because I grew up in a different time, but though I often disagree with Republicans, I actually never learned to hate them the way the far right that now controls their party seems to hate our president and a lot of other Democrats.
I love that phrase from President Clinton. Never learn to hate them. That phrase, learn to hate, is a really powerful phrase about our politics in general. Jacob, you've written a report about a document that's really interesting about what a second-term agenda might look like. And I'm curious what the kind of contours of it, and is it any good if we have the same, it's easy to write a document saying this is what things should be like, but when you're facing the kind of political challenges of this Republican opposition, how do you get from here to there?
Well, I should say first, I wrote it with this Yale law student, Nate Lowenthal, who is great, and that made it relatively easy, but it was still a big challenge. We decided that we wanted to really lay out what it would take to get the economy moving again in the short term and to help start moving in the right direction to restore the middle class in the long term. And, there really isn't a kind of vigorous agenda that's on the other side from the kind of austerity agenda of Ryan and now Romney. And so that was our goal. And we had a second goal, which was to get some of the major grassroots progressive groups on board. And so ultimately it was endorsed by the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the National Council of La Raza, the National Leadership Coalition on Civil Rights, the Center for Community Change, which all told have millions of members who are out there at the grassroots talking about this. And that would be the other thing I would just say is that after the election you have the leverage that comes from this, and you have the leverage that comes from having outside groups that are pushing for something else. And so that's what gives me hope over the longer term. The president obviously has his own challenges. He's articulated some of these ideas, but he really hasn't offered a kind of bold set of prescriptions. So someone has to be out there kind of opening up some space. And so, if AFL-CIO and SEIU and other groups are saying, look, we have to have a set of solutions that are up to the scale of the challenges we face, I'm hopeful that will at least open up some broader discussion in the next few years.
I want to turn this to you, which is that this is a close race. It looks like the president is really kind of pulling ahead in the wake of this convention, and Nate Silver's been tweeting about this, and there's some promising signs from the standpoint of the president's re-election campaign. This convention did what it needed to do. Quickly, if the shoe's on the other foot, you go and serve in Congress in January with President Mitt Romney, how are you going to see yourself interacting with the Republican administration?
The work is going to be tough, to say the least. There's a lot of things that would concern me in that scenario, one of which is that's very personal to me. I have some friends who are on their way to Afghanistan now from the Hawaii Army National Guard. Mitt Romney's positions on foreign policy, his position on Afghanistan, really that would be open-ended. Who knows how long we would end up staying there is something that worries me tremendously. I think
that's really one of his many positions.
One of his many, yeah, exactly. And which is the point, right? It's hard to know exactly how things will be if his positions keep changing. And I think the burden on the Democrats will really be to communicate. We have to really work hard. I think better than we have been communicating to people, middle-class families across the country, about what it is we're trying to do to be able to get that kind of broad-based grassroots support.
I should end on this note, which is that, for whatever obstruction there is in the future, the things that have been done, and particularly the Affordable Care Act, right, it will die. It will be killed by President Mitt Romney.
That's right.
Very early on. He'll kill it using budget reconciliation. They'll, if Mitt Romney's elected, there's a Republican Senate. It doesn't survive. The most remarkable, in some ways, achievement on of domestic policy for the center left in this country, the Democratic Party and progressives, since Medicare, I would say, is on the table. Forget any forward-looking obstruction. Yeah. I just want to leave on that note. I want to thank Jacob Hacker, professor of political science at Yale University, for joining us this morning. Great to have you here. All right, Democrats take it to Republicans on foreign policy when we get back. While much of President Obama's domestic agenda has been stymied by a obstructionist Republican Party in Congress the last 2 years, he has been much more unfettered on foreign policy. And Democrats at the convention were eager to point out the president's victories in that area, notably the success of the operation ordered by President Obama that killed Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive.
Take out bin Laden.
Bin Laden.
Bin Laden.
Bin Laden.
Bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden.
Ask Osama bin Laden if he is better off now than he was 4 years ago.
In a video played to introduce President Obama on Thursday night, former President Bill Clinton further emphasized President Obama's singular role in ordering the operation.
That's one thing George Bush said that was right. The president is the decider-in-chief.
President Obama's foreign policy and national security credentials were served up as a stark contrast to the relative lack of foreign policy experience on the Republican ticket, something the president himself pointed out.
My opponent and his running mate are new to foreign policy. But from all that we've seen and heard, they want to take us back to an era of blustering and blundering that cost America so dearly. After all, you don't call Russia our number one enemy, not Al-Qaeda, Russia, unless you're still stuck in a Cold War mind warp.
Joining us now is Jeremy Scahill, my colleague at The Nation, where he is national security correspondent. Great to have you here. It was really striking to me. So yesterday we talked about the sort of classic culture war issues and how aggressive Democrats seemed on things that they had previously been on their heels about, things like marriage equality and choice for women and the Immigration Dream Act. They seem to be leading with that. And the same dynamic, I think, seemed to be true on foreign policy and national security. The invocation of Osama bin Laden, the ridicule. I mean, there was almost this amazing reversal if you look at the 2004 Republican convention to the 2012 Democratic convention. Here is Dick Cheney in 2004 employing this ridicule against John Kerry.
Even in this post-9/11 period, Senator Kerry doesn't appear to understand how the world has changed. He talks about leading a more sensitive war on terror, as though Al-Qaeda will be impressed with our softer side.
And now here's John Kerry, who, of course, was the butt of all those jokes 8 years ago, being the one who's doing the mocking in what was by far the biggest diss track of the convention.
Folks, Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from Alaska. Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV.
Tulsi, I want to come to you on this because you're of a generation of Democratic politicians that came of age during this era of long war. If people are not familiar with your bio, you were elected to the State House at 21. You then signed up for the National Guard, and not just signed up for the National Guard, after you'd been doing some training, volunteered to deploy to Iraq, went to Iraq, came back, did another deployment, that one was in Kuwait, and have continued your political career. You're still a member of the National Guard, if I'm not mistaken. And my understanding is that experience changed your politics quite a bit. You were a conservative, I believe, quite conservative on social issues, certainly, when you were 21, and your deployment changed your politics. And I want you to talk about that and then talk a bit more broadly about what you saw from Democrats in this convention.
Absolutely. My deployments both to Iraq and Kuwait absolutely were life-changing in so many ways. Specifically, with regards to social issues and kind of my politics in general, seeing firsthand the extreme really the extreme negative effects of what can happen in societies where the government tries to be a so-called moral arbiter for its people, and drawing that link from extremeness in the Middle East to some of the conversations that we're having here at home, places where our government should have no presence, whether it's in a doctor's office where a woman is making difficult decisions about her future and her reproductive rights, or about who to love and who we want to spend our lives with. And I think that's an important perspective. Even when we talk about separation of church and state, we hear a lot of conversations here about so-called morality within government, but there are these positions that really need to stay within the realm of your religious beliefs, your church, your culture, your personal lives, your family. And that's really what my experience in the Middle East taught me and caused me to really reflect on the values and beliefs that I had grown up with, and my own views now about government's role within our personal lives here in a place where we celebrate freedom.
To fill in the context for people who don't know, your father is a state politician and extremely prominent in advocating against marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples.
So needless to say, we have some very colorful dinner conversations.
Yeah, I mean, and this in Hawaii, this is a big deal. I mean, he's very well known. He's known for that. He was probably the singular spokesperson the first time the issue came up in the late 1990s. Yeah. You were one of a number of veterans that took the stage. We have a little B-roll of that. And I'm curious what you thought, what was the foreign policy message, the national security message of this Democratic convention to you?
I think clearly the message was delivered by many different speakers throughout the convention. The appreciation and paying tribute and honor to veterans and those who serve, and understanding their contributions to our communities and our country, and also understanding how what our presence is overseas, basically the shrinking global community that we have, and how important it is. And I was glad that they brought this up, because this is an issue that does rise above the partisan politics, and it's an issue that affects families all across the country. And I think that we need to actually do more to express this sense of urgency, where every single day that we are at war, people are losing lives, and families here at home are being affected.
I think there's sort of three lanes this was happening on. There's the appreciation of veterans, celebration of veterans, and talking about veterans issues, which was very prominent. There was the operation on Osama bin Laden, which was obviously very prominent. And then there was kind of everything else, right? Foreign policy, how long are we going to stay in Afghanistan? The drone issue. And I want to talk about that, everything else, and maybe what focus on the first two didn't highlight so much on the third, right after we take this break. Jeremy Scahill, what was your impression of watching this kind of the posture from the Democratic Party at this convention on national security issues, which is what you cover?
Well, I mean, regarding the way that Osama bin Laden's name was used by the Democrats at the convention, it really felt like we were watching a parade of jingoism that belonged in a sports bar. And I think that the fact is that there has been no serious analysis of the president's foreign policy in all of the coverage I've seen of the Democratic National Convention, including MSNBC. There has been no serious, hard-hitting critique of the president's foreign policy from the issues that actually are real, or that distinguish him, from the Republicans. Because the fact is that the Democratic foreign policy is distinguishable from the Republicans only insofar as the president took some of the worst aspects of the Bush-era foreign policy and pushed them forward.
Well, wait a second. That's not entirely fair. I mean, there's some truth to that, but if you look at what's happened on Iran over the past few weeks, I think, where I think the administration has quite skillfully pushed back on pressure that was mounting on them to set a deadline by which they would take military action, I think that was a pretty significant
we have a president who, in a 2-week period, authorized the assassination of 3 U.S. citizens in Yemen, including a 16-year-old boy who was killed while he was having a barbecue with his teenage friends named Abdul Rahman al-Laki. They have never been able to produce who the target of that strike was.
I just want to make sure that we do not know that he was the target.
The president authorized operations over a 2-week period that resulted in the deaths of 3 American citizens, including a 16-year-old boy. And if you're going to use Osama bin Laden's killing as a football to spike on the national stage, I want the president of the United States to explain to the American people why If you're going to use it in such a jingoistic way, yes, if you're going to use it in such a cynical way.
Substantively, I agree with you about the drone policy, but it would be political malpractice to, not kind of milk the bin Laden thing on the national stage when you're running against the Republicans.
I travel in countries where these drone strikes happen. I'm not talking about political malpractice.
Right, but we're talking about the convention. So there's two different things. There's the discussion about the president's foreign policy, but then there's also the discussion about kind of how they're using that foreign policy to win a very important election.
But many of the media discussions, including here on MSNBC about foreign policy during the convention, felt like we were watching an Obama for America meetup, not an actual serious critique of this president's most egregious aspects of his foreign policy, where you do see that of the Republicans. There's all of this going after Romney, and I think it's completely legitimate. But some of the core issues of this president's national security policy are not being debated. And I'm sorry, but watching John Kerry and Joseph Biden criticizing the war in Iraq. They voted for the war in Iraq. Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and shut down debate about Iraq when it was being debated in this country. I mean, there's revisionism, there's jingoism. To me, I'm not thinking about this from a cynical political perspective. I'm talking about life and death issues that cut to the heart of, are we going to follow the Constitution when it comes to due process for American citizens?
We should disaggregate some of the issues, right? Because I think a lot of things are getting bound up in that, right? There is the ending the war in Iraq, right? The status of forces agreement was negotiated by the Bush administration that we adhered to. There was even some evidence we were trying to get out of it. But at the end of the day, the end result was the president did end the war, right? I mean, we were going to keep quite a large force of essentially paid mercenaries behind. There's a huge embassy, but combat troops have been brought home. And I think that is in one column. There's extension. There's the surge in Afghanistan, right? The increased troops. We have 87,000 troops there, and the deadline for that. There's the decision to order the strike against Osama bin Laden, and then there is the massive drone policy and all of the engagements that we've engaged in terms of bombing and drones across other theaters that you've been covering. So I just want to put those out there as distinct things, and then there's Iran.
Yeah.
Right. So let's sort of look at some of those individually rather than as a sort of full portfolio. And Tulsi, I'd like to get your thoughts on it when we come back.